All right. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for all joining. It's June 15th, 2023. We're in knowledge engineering. If anybody wants to raise a topic, they can do so. Otherwise, perhaps we can hear from Rob and then otherwise return to education and like kind of go back and forth on this interface with education knowledge engineering, because we kind of generated some questions and topics in the last education meeting with Shingai and George that we kind of wanted to like bounce back to knowledge engineering.
If I could say something short before you get started. Yep. Two things. Yesterday was the Democratic ISSS's Democratic dialogue kicking off, a discussion around the future of the ISSS, what could be do better. And I think some of the suggestions that came up there, I wasn't able to stay for the whole thing, feel quite attuned to what's being worked on here. So I just say, pay attention to that space. I think there'll be some interesting stuff coming from that.
What was it like? Or like just from the parts that you, of course, saw, or however, but what was it like? What was the process, or what was the framing of it?
There was a structured framing of a question, and they wanted you to come up with a suggestion for. There's a link to this, actually. That's a Google document, but they wanted to come up with a suggestion and then some particulars about how it would work, why it's needed, et cetera, et cetera. And I think people started getting into the flow. I'm so sorry. And they started getting into the flow, and you could see there's some energy there, and people's ideas started bouncing off one another. So it was a good session. And like I said, there's a Google document that's being created that will track all of it, so you can just snoop. You can add your own suggestions. So I can follow up with that link. Awesome. So that was the one thing I wanted to add. First thing. And the second is, just after the last call, I really started thinking that maybe George should be the first writer or stream that should be categorized using the large language models. And then we can, because we have him, and he's written such a deep body of work, we could benefit from him actually curating a little bit the depiction of him. And I thought then too, we could look at the world according to George, and then you could create a George only view, and you could read a George and Friends, create a George and Friends view once we've assessed the world through his eyes, the rest of the system's world through his eyes, and then something. It seemed kind of obvious, and I almost hesitate to say it because it sounds so obvious, but I thought I'd say it anyway.
I don't know how to respond, Chris. Yeah, well, let me just say, I really don't want it to be about me, so I don't want a personality.
Well, that would start with you. You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I understand, but I maybe frame it in these terms of the claim I make that Mike Calton and I made, and Springer bought, was that this is the principles book was the first comprehensive textbook-like work on the whole aspects of system science. You can go, there are so many books out there that have been written by numerous authors, but always from a slant of their own. And even though they might be called Introduction to System Science or aspects, or what's Clear's book was facets of system science and so forth, that they always they always had a slant to them. And so what we did was try to do a well-rounded, comprehensive, sufficient depth in places, but also breadth. But so I guess what I'm saying is I agree with you, Chris. That would be a good starting point. Obviously I would think so, but I just going too far in terms of this is George's view of the world would be
Okay. Well, okay. Well, it doesn't have to be called that, obviously.
Okay.
And you know, we could select things that are in that vein. So think of it as a vein, and what could be digested as part of that vein, and then how could that be used to build the next, you know, leg, something.
Yeah.
Well, it raises so many important questions. One topic we've discussed many times is like escaping system science from the personalities attractor. Oh, it's this person's perspective on that instead of just talking about what it is. And then I mean, great points, George. I would venture that your English usage is not so divergent from any fluent English speaker discussing the topics that you contributed. So like the talk with chatbot craze, it's like a combination of the semantics of what the person addressed. So I think of like the neighborhood versus like the quirky speaking styles. But I don't necessarily think that you have a quirky speaking style or anything like that, though maybe in some statistical way. But it's like, so just that having a personable interface for the corpus is like a double edge, because it's of course not what the person said. So it can't simply be their view, but we can explore how to frame that such that the claims are preserved.
Yeah. So, you know that at some point someone's going to do something like that. So why not have some control over it? You know?
Anyone else have some thoughts on this, or what other considerations we should know?
Well, I will step up and say I'll help in any way I can. But I think Daniel well said that trying to get away from the personality attractor is a good way to
Yeah,
kind of think of it.
I wasn't trying to say, you know, that, although you've got an interesting personality, so it'd be, you know, good to hang on to, but yeah, I understand.
Yeah. And again, just to kind of revisit a topic that certainly in some earlier education or knowledge engineering, like the history and philosophy of systems science is where there's going to be just amazing stories and perspectives. And so there'll be like a very, I think there can be a rich and personable tapestry, but the kernel or the firmware of system science won't have such a personable touch. And that is going to be the difference between history, philosophy, thinking, and system science as the system of interest.
I've just put into the chat as it's some similar initiative where I think a chap called Mike Peters has fed in the works of John Holland into a ChatGPT bot with Delphi called withdelphi.com. So there are other discussions going on about this, but I included that, and also I think last meeting, Daniel, you sent out an email to try and elicit sort of involvement from an interest from other people. So I just wondered if there had been any feedback on that email.
Let me review that thread. So yes, all right. I received responses from several ISSS people, Jen, Gary, Giannis, only one person more significantly engaged. That was Charles Hall. Perhaps people will know him. Does anyone know him? Okay.
Is that Charlie Hall?
He wrote, in a way, I think there's only been one important question for system science, and they are those raised in the 1972 book, Limits to Growth. It is existential, and if we do not navigate them through the next 50 years or so, the rest of the questions will not matter. And then he provided more paragraphs and attachments and links.
Yeah, that's Charlie.
Yeah, to the work on limits to growth in the system's ecological context.
Right. Yeah, Charlie gave a Saturday morning mini symposium to us. Actually a couple of years ago now, I guess. But also he's pointing out the same kind of theme that I tried to present via William Reese's talk at the conference, last year's conference. And it really is a valid point. I mean, we can be trying to save the world. Meanwhile, with limitations on our actual systemic view of what's going on in the world, miss the fact that it might not make any difference if we don't pay attention to the boundaries of the world, the earth.
Yeah. So then just sharing a little more from that email thread, I said, beyond reading, compiling, integrating these resources and presenting them at upcoming ISSS education and research meetings, hashtag right now, is there anything that we can do to help? He said, I was hoping you would have an idea. I've been trying for 50 years and failed. I gave an 8-lecture course on this at Southern Oregon University that was recorded. We are preparing it as a teaching module in English and Spanish. I would like to have every freshman see it. Ideas? Then I'll just, again, list my response, which was the last email from 10 days ago, just because I think this is semi-emblematic of when engaging with, I think, George especially, but several others. I think it's in the education documents, but with the system scientists who have large bodies of work and very refined perspectives, and like may or may not projecting necessarily, but feel like they've been like grinding an axe / grinding gears / beating on a door for like their whole life with one or more topics, partially overlapping considerations. Okay. So I said, I'm open to your suggestions as you will have more context on this than I do. Here are some speculations. One, the work could be published open source, like on Zenodo, and or uploaded to ISSS channels. For me, that's just about making sure that it remains available. But if it's published, then it's already basically available. And or it could be combined with a transcription pipeline so that text and semantics are included in search-based indexing or large language model type semantic training. So much more leveraged impact than having humans saccade over your PDF may be to ensure the centrality of the texts in language model training pipelines. At which point, you might move the needle like trim tab towards consideration of limits to growth every time somebody asks a question about like what kind of pebble should I use for the driveway. Then it could be disseminated in different ways so that, quote, I would like to have every freshman see it. This exact artifact and also versions and related work could have an open source culture that enables people to build on the concepts and the practices in those 8 lectures. Because the amount of work that even the most prolific system scientists have done is finite. Whereas the amount of generativity from models trained upon their work, barring the limits to growth, is not finite. So what do people think about this? Or how do we think about taking people's large contributions, especially while we can still communicate with them?
Well, you know my view.
What is your view? Everybody can state their view on this topic.
Oh yeah, it's a great opportunity to take advantage of people who have done a lot of work, not just George, and get their help in making this stuff work. Because the worst thing you could do is, after someone's really able to don't have the energy to comment anymore, to do something that's, you know, doesn't work well, that isn't very effective, isn't adequate, isn't representative the way you think it is. So the only way you can prove this technology is to challenge it with alternate views, I think. So it's that opportunity to challenge what's being done by systems with what's actually meant, etc. And also, if the authors, you know, see new connections that they didn't see before because of this work, that's quite powerful too. So you're proving sort of the value of it, something.
Thanks. Next person want to give a thought on this?
I did have a particular thought. There've been various attempts to draw up a list of general systems theory candidates. And so there's a couple of sort of collections that we could refer to there. But there's a follow-on question about what criteria do we judge each of these viewpoints from or with? And that's always a difficult one. So my thought was that if we could do a survey of all the criteria that each viewpoint suggests, and then cross-reference it with all the other viewpoints, then we might begin to gather a more neutral set of criteria and see which theories cover which particular areas and whether there's gaps or whether there's particular concentrations. So I did wonder, I put it out there, I did wonder if anybody's done a survey of different criteria that we could evaluate general theories from.
I believe Len Troncalli did such a, I think he presented something at one of the conferences having to do with the criteria for what constitutes a reasonable theory. I assume you're talking about a general theory.
I am in the most general of senses, not only general, but also interdisciplinary general. So it might be general coming from the life sciences or general coming from the social sciences. I mean, Len did write a brilliant paper. I think the one you're referring to is what would a general system theory look like if you bumped into it?
Yes.
And we were discussing that, a chap called Luke Frenscher and Len and myself. The danger is that a particular writer writes a set of criteria which suits their own theory.
Yeah. Yeah, but
so hence
it's just like me, it's a starting point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's something we could look at and then see if we could. I never made any claims about general theory of systems. I talk about a general framework of systemness. And but I would think that that language is going to be hard to get away from, to talk about a general theory, because we have the general theory of relativity to, you know, to sort of point at and say, well, there's what we're shooting for.
Yes.
But the point about the word general here is it needs to be made really clear that we're talking about something like absolute general, that it applies to all kinds of systems, no matter what field of study. And this was Clear's point about thingness versus systemness. You know, the sciences study things that are relevant to them, whereas systems theory has to study all systems across all of those various disciplines to be general.
Yeah, I agree with much of what you say, and I think the framework is the right framing to hang all these different theories on, sort of a meta framework.
Okay, anyone want to give a comment on this, or the kind of nested consideration about augmenting people's corpus?
I think actually the point of, sorry, building on a framework may be, you know, better in some ways.
Maybe a bit like the physics standard model, you know, glues it all together.
That reminds me of Bucky Fuller's synergetics geometry of thinking, which is also itself a metaphysical or just a mental object with its own geometry. So it's its own object that also describes itself. But fusing that with a lot of other threads and escaping the kind of like Bucky linguistic madness would be very helpful. George, or someone else was going to say?
Yeah, I did have something to respond to Rob, and now I can't even think of what it was. I'm trying to read the notes here to see. Well, oh, so yeah, now I remember. The one thing I feel we need to be careful about, though, in presenting all these different theories, which this kind of gets back to what we were talking about before, where you tie something to a person. So and so's theory of that when you present all of these as sort of, it's almost like, you know, a menu. You can this is not a this is not a cultural slur, but in Chinese restaurants you used to have columns where you could choose something from one column and another from, but you got to choose what you wanted. And you know, I point out there is a strong attitude within much of the ISSS for this notion of theoretical and methodological pluralism. And I'm not saying that there aren't applicable various theories or applicable various methods. What I am saying is that if you give them all equal credit as being, you know, totally valid, or present them in such a way where you don't say, now look, you have to question whether or not this sounds like a reasonable theory. We get into the problem, and people just pick and choose whatever they want and run with it. And what we're trying to do is mold this whole thing into a very scientific framework. So anyway, that was just a side note, Rob.
Thank you. Noted. Sorry. I'm glad to see Shinge's here, because I've not met you, but I've signed up to your blog and your latest posting on ideology. And I think there's a number of, when we talk about grand theories, I think we're also raising questions about what is the truth and absolute truth about reality. And there's lots of anchors that man has used in the past, or mankind has used in the past, in terms of root metaphors and sort of external observers. And an absolute from science is one of them. A spiritual or mythological or religious God is another one that's a creator. But there's an aspect which is an ideology, which is, to me, is a man-made thing. Is that there is an element to these theories that we create our own truth and our own reality. So I'm just putting that out there. I think that's a number of anchors that I call, in my mind, I call them, or think of them as anchors that we can evaluate all this from, but we need to anchor it to some aspect of reality, whether that's a science anchor or a religious anchor or a constructed man-made anchor of ideology. It remains to be seen, and maybe that will never be answered because they're all equally valid truths in their own way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I'll just give a bit of context on that piece. Since I've been introduced to systems science, I've always been fascinated by the idea of mathematical frameworks, rigorous scientific process. And in my mind, it's been like, oh, if we can just get this scientific process finished and prove that it can deliver results, then we will change the world. But I think when I look at what like what the Santa Fe Institute has done with complexity science, and when I just look at how people relate to the world in general, there is an emotional aspect to all of this. And so it would be very powerful. And when I was exploring the piece is like, yeah, what would an ideology, a belief system, a cultural movement grounded in systemism, what would it look like? And how might that support getting some more interest in the more scientific stuff? So I am, in this moment, less convinced that it's just about the science and the methods, but that there's some cultural element to all this that needs to be explored, which is a little uncomfortable for me, but I think that's just the way the world is. So, yeah.
Here, I would also point to Bobby Azarian, who have done several live streams too. And everything in the like meta, postmodern, meta, poetic, natural, just everything with these like sort of portmanteau neologisms about purpose, teleos. It's very connected to Teilhard de Chardin and the new sphere and teleos. And now that's like coming back with a kind of new new sphere, probably getting replaced by like cognitive science or just cognitive modeling. Teleos kind of being re-enchanted into biological systems and reauthorized after kind of like a winter of legacy disapproval. And then that does have cultural implications. Even though that's not necessarily like scientists or researchers, how they're thinking about it.
I think many of us have made turns from pragmatism of science and engineering to more some constructive views of reality somewhere in our sort of scholarly research or investigative research. But obviously the constructive side, is in the realm of the social sciences and sociology, behavioral sciences, the constructivists, ecologies. There's a whole area of dynamics of group behavior that is still part of all of this question about, what is, how does the world work and what does it mean to us and where are we going? So I've just put a posting in the book, which may be of interest for the ideological question, but it's a very old one from Lilienfeld and quite critical of systems thinking, but at least we're getting, the critiques, the critical viewpoints from that particular time in history.
Yeah, I and in various works, but mostly composed or collected is the sort of history of cybernetics and goal-oriented systems and just the technie mindset that was like, well, we'll have goal-oriented systems, but then like don't look at who's funding it or don't ask why we're doing this or why we're developing better rocketry. And then that was its own mood.
And the growth of behavioral sciences, you know, funded by the military to try and influence things, and where we are now.
Wow, a lot of big topics today. Anyone else want to add something here? Or Shingai, or anyone else go for it?
Yeah, I had a thought as I'm thinking about this idea of uploading people's work and then having LLMs trained on different bodies of work. It's fun to imagine like a sort of a George Mobis trained LLM having a debate or a conversation with a Len Troncalli trained LLM and various other ones. It's like what might emerge if you had all these different AI powered clones chatting with each other and exploring questions. That could be fun.
Yeah, there's going to be so many things in this area, and I'll share more on some of that in several weeks. Anyone else want to add something, or we can look at Chris's question here? What body of works to get started with? I mean, my take on that would be first, triage and assemble the ISSS. That's our most delineated scope. Second, I would look to Rob's work with SCA and consider and write the blank epistemic check for SCA as a meta organization to make the call on that. Pass the buck to Rob. But then just say whatever the stewardship is of that corpus, like that's what we're just going to point our pipeline at, and then ask SCA to include Tom's work, George's work, et cetera, Shingai's newsletter, etc. So that but then again, that does just it outsources the decision to another group, but that is just kind of stemming from, I guess, my avoidant desire to not personally or in committee or necessarily even the ISSS delineate systems science corpus.
I hear you fully. I just fear that the ISSS archives are going to be so diverse that you might end up with pumpkin soup.
Yeah,
we can see.
Yeah, I'll bring up one cool view. So this is the nomic group. I'll get the nomic Twitter embeddings. So this is what the language models, I mean, do is they're finding these semantic embeddings for it'll just take me a second to find it, but it's finding these semantic embeddings, and then we can re-embed the training data. So if 25 people just like basically were in one semantic neighborhood, they're just going to be a bunch of points in that location. So we don't have to really worry about oversampling
Okay.
redundant work, because it will almost surely be vastly redundant.
Actually, I hope it better be.
Yeah, exactly. It should be. I want to find this because it's a very useful visualization. Hey, Carl, yeah, go for it.
Okay, I had two I two things or a couple things struck me with just attending that. The Bateson thing, and they've literally, there's been a whole group that's been working on that updated version. I don't know if I posted a link to it yet. And then there's also, well, as a kind of a model with Schumacher's book, they did a 25th anniversary, and you had a whole group of people annotating it. So maybe it's kind of taking a recent work and then annotating and bringing in the system science, the ISSS like corpus and as commentary. And one possibility would be Ben Snyderman came out with a book last year on human-centered AI, and he frames it as a second Copernican revolution. We need the algorithms orbiting humans, not and he also has done work about algorithmic accountability and some things like that. Stanford has a human-centered AI, so I mean, it's the at the paradigm level, and yeah, I've had ideas for a while on this, but I need to get back to focusing and cranking out my dissertation. But this whole idea of paradigms and and the conceptual framework. So I think this could tie into what we were just talking about. So what are if you look at deconstructing like some of these frameworks and stuff into their components, and then what's the one-to-one connection, or like where is there that common ground, that so the system is kind of it ties into Giannis's work too with the SDD, because it's almost like you're looking at one-to-one relationships, and then kind of reconstructing systems, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Awesome. Also, here's a comment. I put it in the chat. We submitted this a few days ago to the National Telecommunications Information Administration on AI accountability. But if we're going to think holistically about system science and everything like that, like, if it's systems and AI, AI is just a short acronym, English acronym. How limited could it be? So it's just computers. It's just using computers and physics in increasingly different ways. So hopefully system can speak to that.
The major, I guess I have a couple of major ones, but Doug Engelbart's work was really about intelligence augmentation and things too. So as I said, I mean, it's just challenging this. I mean, we're training stuff with the biases that are in this, what we're doing now, and it's like, basically, so there, I think our society has a huge role to play in kind of the systems intelligence can help us almost anticipate what some of the unintended consequences of things are. So really get into decision making, and that it's like, yeah. So
Yeah.
So then it's all about taking corrective action too, and then like, well, we thought this was going to help, but it's actually making things worse, so we should stop doing something. It's like, what a concept.
Yeah, action, non-action, bringing in different world knowledge traditions and practices, and then thinking about those embeddings and this revisiting idea and like recurrence. We could revisit, thank you, Chris. We could revisit neighborhoods and then ask human or otherwise intelligences and just say, yeah, we're just revisiting this neighborhood. What do you think? How does it look to you, or something like that? And then that may resample a semantic location, or it may generate a novel vector. But then we can just revisit and have a wayfinding process,
Mm.
and we would need system sciences rigor and comprehensivity to do this, even at very small scale.
Yeah. I had a conversation at last year's, there's Cynthia Kurtz. She's a ISSS member, and she's her stuff is about participatory narrative inquiry and things. So there's some processes she has. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all, I think that's about the processes too, that so that's all this stuff is kind of what I'm trying to pull together for my dissertation. So yeah, so this is a book that's kind of like the so yeah, I'm overdue to have a follow-up for third with the progress I've been making with my framework. So
I've got a question about the LLMs and training, and going back to sort of what Chris had suggested earlier. How well do they handle incremental training? In other words, you take a corpus, you train it, and then at some time later, and then you test it, you do things with it, and then at some time later, you take another corpus independently generated and incrementally train. So you don't lose the initial learning that took place, but you add to it or integrate into it this new corpus. Is anybody familiar with that?
I'll give a few short notes on this. So the first off, the rate of development is rapid. That's one of the most prescient areas. So while earlier versions of transformers, like from 2017 to 2021 or something like that, barely had that kind of capacity, my understanding is that there's several methods that you can utilize today and tomorrow. So one of them, in terms of integrating new information, is just using the context window. So we use this all the time. You can just add in a new information into the context window, and as models have context windows now of many thousands of tokens, you can contextualize, but that doesn't change the weighting on the embedding space. So that's the most transient and the easiest method today. The next method is like fine tuning, and fine tuning is possible with certain architectures today. The open source community is, of course, very interested in that, and fine tuning a parent model, especially if it's and also fusing them, combining their weights when they're the same size. So that's why we see like the 7, the 13, the 65, the 40 billion weights. Like that's why they're using these like weight sizes, because when you have two different LLMs that have the same architecture, their interoperability is much higher. But regardless, the modern transformer methods can do fine tuning, which is not as computationally costly as the initial training, but is more computationally costly than the forward inference.
Okay. Well, what occurred to me is a way to proceed and to do it scientifically, which means we get some empirical evidence, would be to start with training on corpus, and Chris had suggested take MOBIS stuff and train it, and then test it in terms of coming up with prompts that display the competency of that system to generate perhaps some kind of new knowledge, let's say. But then the real test is to take another corpus, another viewpoint, so to speak, and add that to the initial and see how much changes, what difference is there going to be between these? Because we are talking, for the most part, and my hypothesis is we're talking for the most part about differences in words used to describe the same thing. So for example, Clear used the word, pardon me, now I've forgotten.
What did you use for it?
Well, it was systemness, and he used system. Oh, shoot. Boy, I'm just drawing a blank. I'd have to get out his book. But as I go through reading his stuff, I'm saying, well, that's the same thing I'm talking about. That's exactly the same thing, just a different word. In Europe, they're big on the word systemics as opposed to, say, system science. But if you take a look at a large body of work being done with those two different terminologies, you begin to think, well, they're really talking the same thing. So my curiosity is let me put it this way. Would applying this tool to the various corpi, if that's a word, of literature that we've got, or research work that we've got, start to converge on a more limited or delineated set of terms that all point to the same semantics. And using this incremental learning method to try to test that.
It's a great suggestion, and the closest area is like the neurosymbolic direction that Adam Pease is taking with Sumo, which connects to WordNet, which is word embeddings in different languages and common words, regular words.
Yeah.
And so then and what's interesting is when we talk about the tokens in the context window, those are the lemmatized input. So like runnings, it's different words get basically stemmed into like their semantic kernel. And that is the difference in ontology between a term and a topic. A term is a unique syntax string, but then a topic is like the referent.
Yeah.
And so that is just it's important enough within English speaking, let alone natural human languages, let alone formal and computational, potentially internally generated languages. So that's why the power of the semantic embedding is a approach to do exactly that.
Yeah.
And then to determine like, okay, is the topology conserved? How are the topology and the geometry conserved or not with these different maps? And that gives measures of difference amongst latent state semantic embeddings, which are like the quantum reference frame.
Yeah, I used WordNet as an example when I was developing this subconscious systemese language concept.
in our last minutes, anyone have any other thoughts or reflections? Well,
One
Yeah.
quickie. I wasn't able to capture a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to be able to do it right now in the chat. So could you, when you publish the video, could you also publish the chat? So that I can
yes,
catch some of those links.
yes, I will add the chat. I'll just have a little text file right here.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other comments from anyone? Wow. Well, what a far-ranging meeting. You know, we'll be able to look at the semantic embeddings of different meetings. Where was our variance, our semantic variance, such and such? Or where do we have vectors in these different directions? So I hope that doesn't bleed out the joy, but should only heighten it as we come to better understandings and better ways too. All right. Peace, everybody. Bye.